I had to purify them. I had to rid my home of this sin. Pastor Ezekiel Vaughn built his church on fear and obedience. His sermons roared about sin, punishment, and the fires of hell. His words drilled into the minds of his congregation, insisting that God's law was absolute. But within his own home, his rule was even harsher. His two teenage sons, Elijah and Samuel, grew up under his iron fist, shaped by his unyielding faith, expected to obey his every command. Yet they harbored a secret, one so damning it could never be spoken aloud. One night, Ezekiel stumbled upon the unthinkable. In that moment, the preacher vanished, replaced by a man consumed by rage, disgust, and something darker than sin itself. By the time the police arrived, the house was a bloodbath. The bedroom floor was soaked in blood, and Ezekiel knelt beside the lifeless bodies of his sons, his lips moving in prayer. This isn't just a tale of murder, it's a story of fanaticism, control, and the horrors born from blind faith, taken to extremes. Did Ezekiel Vaughn truly believe he was delivering justice, or was he just another monster hiding behind the Bible? Stay tuned as we unravel this tragic tale. Welcome to YouTube channel The Crime Hour. Pastor Ezekiel Vaughn was no man of mercy. He preached redemption, but in his home there was only judgment. To his congregation, he was a prophet, a man of unshakable faith, his voice fiery, his eyes filled with fury. They hung on his every word, terrified of disappointing him and God. To his family, he was a dictator. Each morning, the Vaughn household followed the same routine: prayers before sunrise, breakfast in silence, and a daily reminder of God's law. Ezekiel demanded his wife's submission, his son's obedience, and the eradication of all sin. Elijah, 17, and Samuel, 15, knew no kindness from their father. They were expected to be strong, unwavering in faith, and to uphold the family's reputation. Weakness was forbidden, emotion was not allowed. But they had a secret, one that defied everything their father had taught them. At first it was just comfort, small touches in the dark, whispered reassurances, stolen moments where they could be themselves without fear. Over time, that bond grew into something more, something neither could define, something they knew had to remain hidden. Their mother, Ruth Vaughn, 44, saw more than she let on. But Ruth had learned long ago that silence was survival. She had spent over 2 decades in Ezekiel's shadow, watching him twist faith into something monstrous, watching him break their sons just as he had broken her. Yet she said nothing. For years their home was a prison of discipline and secrecy, a silent war between control and defiance. Until one night, when Ezekiel walked in on the unimaginable and the fragile silence shattered in blood and screams. It began as an ordinary night, the kind where secrets felt safe. The house was cloaked in silence, save for the distant hum of cicadas outside. The Vaughn home was always quiet after dark. Ezekiel demanded it. But behind Elijah's locked door, there was soft laughter, the rustling of sheets, the quiet exchange of something fragile and forbidden. Then, a creak, a shift in the hallway. The door burst open with the force of a thunderclap, flooding the room with light and fury. There stood Pastor Ezekiel Vaughn, his broad frame filling the doorway, casting a shadow over the bed where his 2 sons were engaged in an intimate act. The moment hung in unbearable stillness. Elijah froze, Samuel gasped, and Ezekiel saw everything. For a fleeting second, he didn't move. His chest rose and fell, his breath hitched, his lips twisted into something unreadable. Then his face contorted into pure rage. Abominations! The room erupted into chaos. Samuel scrambled away, bare feet hitting the floor, reaching for escape. Elijah threw himself in front of his brother, arms outstretched, voice shaking. "Dad, please just listen." The slap came like a gunshot. Elijah's head snapped sideways, his vision blurring with pain, blood filling his mouth. Samuel screamed, tried to grab him, but Ezekiel's fist collided with his ribs, sending him crashing to the floor. The preacher's breath came in ragged gasps, his hands trembling as if holding back a flood of holy rage. And then he didn't hold back. He plunged for the bedside drawer, yanking it open violently, his fingers wrapping around the cold steel of his revolver. Elijah saw it in slow motion, his father's fingers curling around the handle, his eyes burning with something final. Samuel let out a choked sob, whispering, "Daddy, please." But there was no mercy left in Ezekiel Vaughn, only judgment, only the word of God, and a gun about to deliver it. The first gunshot ripped through the silence like a thunderclap. Elijah jerked violently, his body snapping backward as the bullet tore through his chest. Blood bloomed across his white undershirt, spreading like a grotesque flower. His mouth fell open, but no words came, only a wet gurgle as blood bubbled from his lips. His legs buckled and he collapsed onto the bed, his body twitching in the final spasms of life slipping away. His eyes, wide with horror and betrayal, locked onto his father's. He didn't have time to beg, to plead, to explain. His breath hitched once, and then he was still. Samuel's scream split the air, raw, primal, anguished. He threw himself over Elijah's body, gripping his brother's bloodied hands, shaking him, trying to wake him. "Elijah, no, please, no." His father took slow, deliberate steps forward, the revolver still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. Samuel turned, his tear-streaked face twisted in grief, trembling so hard he could barely speak. "Daddy, please," he choked out. "We didn't mean to." The second shot blew through his ribcage. Samuel's body convulsed, his small frame snapping back as the impact sent him crashing onto Elijah's lifeless chest. His fingers, slick with his brother's blood, instinctively reached out, clutching Elijah's hand one final time. A ragged gasp left his lips, his eyes fluttered, his body shuddered, and then he went limp. The only sound left in the room was the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Ezekiel stood over their bodies, gun still raised, his finger frozen on the trigger. His chest rose and fell in deep, shuddering breaths. The sharp scent of gunpowder and blood thickened the air, mingling with the suffocating stillness. His hands trembled, his grip tightening around the weapon until his knuckles turned white. His breath came in ragged gasps, but his eyes were eerily calm. He looked down at his sons, their bodies twisted together in death, their hands still clasped, their blood pooling like a crimson halo beneath them. Ezekiel lifted his face toward the ceiling, his voice barely a whisper. "God told me to do it." Ruth Vaughn was already awake when the first gunshot rang through the house. She had heard the shouting, the rage in Ezekiel's voice, the pleading in her son's cries. She had heard something break, something heavy hit the floor, and in her chest a cold fear took root. She threw off the covers, her heartbeat pounding in her ears as she stumbled toward the door. Then the first shot came, like a bomb detonating inside the house. The sound tore through her, shaking the walls, rattling the glass of the framed Bible verses hanging in the hallway. Then came the scream, Samuel's, a sound so full of pain, grief, and desperation that it nearly made her knees buckle. Then another shot, another life stolen. Ruth screamed, hands flying over her mouth, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She rushed to the bedroom door, hands shaking so badly she could barely turn the knob. She shoved it open and froze. The sight in front of her would haunt her for the rest of her life. Elijah and Samuel lay motionless on the floor, their bodies twisted together, hands still locked in a final grip. Blood pooled beneath them. So much blood, more than she had ever seen. And Ezekiel, he was just standing there, gun still raised, chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths, lips moving in silent prayer. For a moment, Ruth couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Then her body took over. She staggered back, tripping over herself as she turned and ran. Her bare feet slammed against the hardwood floor. She had to get out. She had to get help. She burst into the kitchen, hands shaking violently as she grabbed the phone, nearly dropping it twice before she managed to press 911. "911, what's your emergency?" Her voice barely came out. My husband shot them. Oh my God, he shot them." "Ma'am, calm down. Who did he shoot?" Sobs tore through her chest, her vision blurred, her body racked with uncontrollable trembling. "My boys, my babies, he killed my boys." "Ma'am, is the suspect still in the house?" She turned wildly, looking back toward the hallway, expecting to see Ezekiel coming for her next. But he wasn't there. He was still in the bedroom, still kneeling beside their bodies, gun in his lap, eyes closed, still praying. "Ma'am, listen to me. I need you to get somewhere safe. Officers are on the way." She could barely hear the dispatcher over the sound of her own heartbeat, over the thunder in her ears, over the silent screams trapped in her chest. She slid down onto the floor, rocking back and forth, clutching the phone like a lifeline. Somewhere in the distance, she heard sirens. But it was too late. It had been too late the second Ezekiel walked through that door. The sirens grew louder, wailing through the quiet Texas night, their shrill urgency cutting through the stillness of death. Ruth Vaughn sat curled against the kitchen counter, phone still clutched in her trembling hands, rocking back and forth as she listened to the distant hum of approaching justice. Then red and blue lights flooded the house. A sharp knock rattled the front door. "This is the police. Open up." Ruth couldn't move. She didn't have to, because Ezekiel Vaughn did it himself. The preacher, calm as a man walking into Sunday service, stepped out of the bedroom and into the hallway. His footsteps were measured, deliberate. Blood still clung to his hands, dark smudges against his pale skin. His white undershirt was soaked with his son's blood. His Bible was tucked under his arm, as if this were just another day at the pulpit. He reached the door, gripped the handle, and opened it himself. The first officer on the scene raised his gun, ready for anything, but Ezekiel just lifted his hands, slow and steady. "I surrender myself to the Lord," he said, voice low, calm, almost serene. "Where are the victims?" one of the officers demanded, stepping into the house, his boots crushing the glass from a shattered picture frame. Ezekiel tilted his head slightly, as if pondering the question. Then, without hesitation, he turned back toward the bedroom. "Inside," he said simply. 3 officers rushed past him, weapons drawn. The moment they entered, the first officer gagged. The second muttered a curse under his breath. The third just froze, eyes wide, taking in the horror. The 2 boys lay lifeless, entangled in death, their fingers still locked in one last desperate grasp. The blood had spread, pooling deep into the floorboards, soaking into the mattress, painting the walls with a crimson spray of violence. In Scripture, it looked more like a sacrificial offering than a crime scene. "Jesus Christ," one of the officers whispered, shaking his head. Back in the hallway, Ezekiel didn't move. He didn't fight, didn't argue, didn't beg for mercy as they forced him to the ground, cold metal clamping around his wrists. He simply closed his eyes and whispered, "I did what had to be done." They hauled him to his feet, the officer gripping his arms tighter than necessary. "You sick bastard," one of them muttered under his breath. Still, Ezekiel didn't react. As they dragged him past Ruth, she flinched away from him, her body trembling with terror, grief, and fury. Ezekiel finally looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time in years. His eyes softened. "I saved them," he whispered. Ruth let out a choked sob, pressing her hand to her mouth as the officers shoved him toward the waiting patrol cars. The flashing red and blue lights bathed the house in a sickening glow, illuminating the faces of curious neighbors, horrified onlookers, and the officers who couldn't hide their disgust as they placed Ezekiel into the back of the cruiser. He lifted his chin toward the sky, his lips moving in silent prayer. Inside the house, crime scene investigators moved in, stepping over blood-soaked floorboards. And somewhere in the distance, the first rays of sunlight broke through the Texas sky. The trial of Pastor Ezekiel Vaughn was unlike anything the town of Fort Worth, Texas, had ever seen. The courtroom was packed from the very first day, filled with grieving church members, horrified neighbors, and reporters hungry for a story that seemed too monstrous to be real. But it was real. The charges were brutal: 2 counts of first-degree murder, use of a deadly weapon, and endangering human life. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Marcus Whitfield, wasted no time laying out their case. "This is not a man of God," Whitfield declared. "This is a man who committed cold-blooded execution on his own flesh and blood in the name of a twisted version of faith." Ruth Vaughn took the stand first. The courtroom fell into a hush as she walked up, a ghost of the woman she once was. Her face was hollow, her hands trembled, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I heard my babies die that night," she said. "I heard them beg, I heard them scream, and I did nothing." A ripple of sobs spread through the crowd. She told them everything: the fear, the control, the years of silence under Ezekiel's rule. "I should have saved them," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "But I was too afraid of my own husband to stop him." The prosecution then turned to the evidence. Ballistics matched the gun in Ezekiel's possession to the bullets pulled from his sons' bodies. Blood spatter analysis proved that both boys had been shot at close range, execution style. Ruth's frantic 911 call played for the jury, her voice cracking as she screamed, "My boys! He killed my boys!" But it was Ezekiel's own words that sealed his fate. The court played his confession video, recorded just hours after his arrest. "They were sinners," Ezekiel said in the interrogation room. "Abominations in my house. I did what had to be done. I cleansed them before their souls were lost forever." His lack of remorse, his cold, matter-of-fact tone, sent shivers through the jury box. Then came the defense's argument. Ezekiel's attorneys tried to argue insanity, claiming that he was under a religious delusion and believed he was following divine instruction. "He is not a monster," his lawyer pleaded. "He is a broken man, a man who believed he was doing God's work." But the prosecution tore that argument apart. "This wasn't divine intervention," Whitfield countered. "This was premeditated murder." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. The verdict was unanimous: guilty. When the judge read the sentence, death by lethal injection, the courtroom erupted in emotion. Some cheered for justice, others wept. Church members bowed their heads in prayer, and Ruth collapsed into her seat, sobbing uncontrollably. As the bailiffs escorted Ezekiel out, someone in the gallery shouted, "Burn in hell, Pastor!" For the first time since his arrest, Ezekiel finally reacted. He smirked, lifted his eyes toward the ceiling, and whispered, "I will meet my Maker with clean hands." And then, just like that, he was gone. Ezekiel Vaughn thought he was saving his family, but in reality, he was just another man who used faith as a weapon. He was judge, jury, and executioner. But who gave him the right? Was he a religious extremist, or was he a murderer hiding behind the Bible? And the most disturbing question of all, how many more men like him are out there, waiting to do the same? If this story shocked you, please like, share, and subscribe to The Crime Hour for more cases that reveal the dark truths hiding behind faith, power, and control. Thank you for watching.